But thank you all so much for joining us. You're here for the 5 trigger phrases every leader should stop using right now, like right now. And with us, we have myself. My name is Ariana Shannon. I'm the marketing director here at Sales Intel and relatively new director. Been in the space for a while, managed people before, but really when there's something about a switch in a title that has a lot more impact to it. So I'm excited to be here with Nicole Kelly, who has a lot of experience in the space. She has worked with, or she works with presently Windward Consulting, has an executive role at Red Monocle, where she helps them with a lot of decisions that they have there, and has spent a lot of time understanding emotional intelligence and the workplace and how you can really create a great environment and what that should look like. Was there anything I missed, Nicole, that you want to add?
That sounds great. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I got to tee you up. You're awesome. I love chatting with you. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Uh, for today's agenda, really straightforward. We're going to go through mental health in the workplace, the 5 trigger phrases that we advertised, what creating a safe environment actually looks like, and then of course the live Q&A where you can pretty much ask us anything. We'll answer it to the best of our ability. All right, so why it matters. We'll go ahead and let the experts start in on this one. So take it away, Nicole.
Yeah, so mental health in the workplace is probably one of the core elements that actually affects people's productivity. It is, the thing that really, if you're not in a good mental health space, it's very difficult to focus. And if you can't focus, you can't perform. And so, if you start considering how mental health is affecting your staff and your employees, you'll start to realize that it affects not only productivity but also interpersonal relationships. If someone's not in a good mental health space, it's also difficult sometimes for them to connect. That feeling of isolation actually is one of the things that contributes to mental health problems. Performance, as we said, productivity and performance go hand in hand. If I'm not productive, I'm not going to be meeting my objectives. And then finally, job satisfaction. If I'm in a low place with my mental health, it's very difficult for me to feel gratitude and to feel appreciation for my role. And also, and really just feeling job satisfaction as a whole.
No, and that's so true because you see that, and I'm a believer that everyone has experienced this at some point. Normally, when it's talked about, it's at its furthest extreme, and that's burnout, which is not good because then you've reached that point of where all these things have kind of culminated into your life, and by the time you get there, you look up and go, "Well, how did I get here?"
Yeah.
So I'm
Well, and I think it's even, as leaders, there's the just general job stress. I just wrote an article about this today. There's like some positions that are just super stressful, and stress is a part of the job, and it's literally in the job description. And then there are other situations where you have someone in the workplace that has a mental health diagnosis that you may or may not know of. I think that a lot of people, 1 in 10 people, have a mental health diagnosis today, and I think a lot of leaders don't necessarily have awareness that their team has someone on it who has a mental health diagnosis. Oh my gosh, do you hear that? That's all like somebody, and the construction is starting upstairs. So here we go.
hey, it is work from home life, Nicole. This is, I think, the last webinar we had with
This
you.
building, and I'm hearing construction. So, but as you start looking at your team and you start to evaluate their mental health, you have to not only consider what's happening and what you're seeing in the workplace, but also what's happening in their home life. And that's where the blind spots happen, is that we don't know that somebody might be in an abusive relationship, or we don't know that someone is struggling with depression, or we don't know that someone has recently lost a loved one that might have been close to them, but might not be a primary, person in their family. So if you start to consider all of that, all of those contributors to someone's mental health, it becomes really obvious that this is something that every leader needs to be thinking about.
No, absolutely. Because at any level in the organization, especially if you're managing other people, you are trying to get your stuff done, but then you're also wanting to make sure that they're like you said, also being the productivity. Because as leaders, that's what we want to make sure of. First of all, of are we moving forward towards our goals? But then also there's that next elevation of just not being a productivity driver, but really investing in your team as much as you can. And that comes from the like, hey, like, how are you doing? And working those questions into your flows. And I'm getting a little ahead of us because I know we're going to cover those in a couple of slides here.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's go ahead and jump into just some of the trigger phrases that can impact anyone that really are having these conversations with, and why they're so impactful.
Yeah. So the first one, they're insane, right? They're mental, they're crazy. These are things that we say in passing, and we don't consider how it actually affects someone who has a mental health diagnosis. And that in their world, people calling them crazy or insane is like the worst thing that can happen, because it's really questioning their, a bit like people's perspective on whether or not they trust them to make good decisions in life. So it becomes this personal identifier that we use casually, saying like, oh, they're so crazy because they're doing something that we don't necessarily agree with, not anything related to mental health. But when you say something like this and you have someone in the room who has a diagnosis that you're unaware of, you essentially break trust with them, because they view you as someone who judges people with mental health diagnosis, and that casually uses it as an insult in conversation. So this is like a key way to destroy the relationship without even realizing it with somebody who's had a diagnosis.
Mm. Yeah, and it's I also like where you point out that it's not necessarily to that person directly,
Right.
because you're going to have there's always the company grapevine, whether that's through like the inner circles that you have with people, or through Slack communications or Discord communications or email, however you're choosing to communicate as an organization. The comments of other people in your space get around,
Yeah.
whether you realize it or not. Uh,
Yeah. And a lot of times this isn't even said about the person you're talking to, right? Like you're talking to someone with a mental health diagnosis and you're talking about someone else, and you destroy the credibility, because what the way you talk about other people is really how we think that you're going to talk about us, right? So if you're talking about someone else and you're saying that they're insane, then that's something that you're probably saying about me behind my back. And that's how you destroy the trust very quickly.
oh, absolutely. Let's go on to the next one.
So this one is they're ill. And this one's a real interesting one, because as someone who's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I can tell you that it's very important for me on a mental health basis with my insurance company that I have a diagnosis that says I'm mentally ill. But if you look at it in the social context of saying that someone is ill or someone is sick when they have a mental health diagnosis, it's not really in congruence to how people with mental health diagnoses view themselves. I can tell you that personally, I don't view myself as mentally ill. I view myself as I have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I also don't identify as a bipolar person. So when you say things like they're ill, you're placing a judgment on them, that is saying that they're somehow lesser than in society. And when we look at mental health diagnoses in particular, when you say someone is mentally ill, that's usually referring to someone who's really on the far end of the spectrum of mental illness, meaning that they no longer can function as a member of society. And when you're talking about people with depression or people with anxiety, they don't consider themselves people who can't function in society. So when you compare them to sociopaths and child molesters and all of these people who are on the other end of the spectrum, and you're putting us all into one bucket, it tells us that you don't really respect us. And so that's one of the reasons that this phrase can really be damaging.
General rule of thumb: people don't like to be generalized.
Yeah,
we
that's a good
we
one.
we don't like to be put into buckets, or also have one of those forced upon us, or like have us feel like someone needs to put us into a cookie cutter mold so that they can better understand it. Now, that's not to say that those generalizations aren't helpful when you yourself are trying to map through, because I mean, this also goes into just general communication with your coworkers and other
Yeah.
people that you interact with. Certain people have communication styles. So being able to identify those and have an idea of like, okay, this person is very direct, or this person loves for me to ask about their family or what's going on. Um, it can be helpful to be mindful, but again, not making those jumps to conclusions, and especially sharing those conclusions with others.
Yeah, exactly. And there are times where this phrase is helpful. So this one is an interesting one. Where this is helpful is not to use it publicly. But when you are in a situation where you have an employee who's struggling, you might need to evaluate their mental health, and they might have a mental illness that's untreated. And when someone is untreated, they are ill at that point, because they have a diagnosis, they're untreated, and that means it's unmanaged. So at that point in time, it's important for us to understand that you will deal with people who have mental illness on board with them at that moment. And mental illness is a state, it's not a permanent state. So with even my own bipolar diagnosis, like there are times when I have been mentally ill, but that's not how I identify as a whole. Another time that this is really, helpful is as you're evaluating your own response to someone's illness. It helps to have compassion when you can see that someone's behavior is that way because they're sick. And if that helps you bring compassion, then that's a really important thing to consider, because when someone is in a place of, I like to call it unwellness, when they're in a place of unwellness, what they need is support and compassion, not judgment. So if you can recognize that this is a helpful tool for you in building your own empathy and compassion, but it's not a helpful tool to use publicly and to use as a judgment for someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll go ahead and jump on to number 3, which is their insert the mental health diagnosis that you think
Right.
that they might have.
Yeah.
I am not a psychologist or psychiatrist. I am not qualified to tell you what you might be dealing with. Now I can, as a leader, you could say like, hey, they seem to have like a high productivity and low productivity. Does that correspond with like maybe a time of year? Maybe I could make an inference that perhaps they're dealing with seasonal depression, or with everyone being home and being isolated, everyone is going through their own form of struggle. Now we're starting to come out of that, I would feel a little bit. More conversations are being had. People are being or feel like they can be a bit more open, because and I love companies, especially Sales Intel. I'll give a quick shout out to them. They have asked us, hey, if anyone needs help here, raise your hand. We will help you. Like whatever you're needing, just let us know.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. And on this one, it's sometimes really hard for people to raise their hands. I think sometimes we don't recognize how difficult it is for someone to become self-aware and acknowledge their diagnosis and actually manage it. So in this particular case, what usually happens, the article actually said, they're bipolar because I have a bipolar diagnosis. So this is, I use my own story in this case. So when you're throwing around a mental health diagnosis to describe someone, and you are not a psychiatrist or a counselor, I just want to say you should stop. I've heard this numerous times in conversation with people who even know that I have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, telling me that their friends are bipolar, who have not received diagnoses, but just because they've read some article and they think that they understand what it's like to be bipolar. And this is damaging for a couple of reasons. One, if you think that you can make a judgment like that for someone, you're not self-aware enough to understand that you don't have the credentials to diagnose someone. Diagnosis in mental health is not easy. So the first thing that I would say is that just recognize, and like this was a piece of awareness that I even had to come into after I had my own diagnosis. And you see that I do all these things. I did all of them and I still have to consistently practice. I had to step back and say, you know what? I'm going to take the high road here, and I'm not going to pretend like I know what someone's diagnosis is. I'm going to understand that maybe they're struggling right now, but my job is not to diagnose them. My job as a leader is to help them get the resources they need. And it's to ask questions. So asking questions rather than throwing around a diagnosis can be very helpful.
No, absolutely. Especially as you're trying to build that trust with your teammates and where you're trying to go, because everyone's working together towards the common goals that you have for your company. But then again, they're also individuals. So what are their goals, and is what's being asked of them in the work environment supporting that home and personal environment that they want?
Yeah.
Yeah, just filling it all together.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, we'll take you to the next one.
Oh, this is one of my favorites. This was said to me about someone else.
I haven't
And it
heard
was
this in a long
that,
time.
the way that it came across was talk about someone with daddy issues. So in the context of that, and this is how it's often used, is, to explain someone's behavior. And when someone actually has daddy issues and you're saying that they have daddy issues behind their back, it is one of the most hurtful things. You're hitting someone in their deepest wound. and you're using it as a reason to talk about why you don't like them or why you don't like their behavior. And it's just incredibly damaging for someone who actually had, like, I'll be the prime example. My father committed suicide when I was 9 years old. There's no way for me to escape that I probably have some daddy issues on board. But someone using that to say why they disagree with something I've done, or they disagreed with a decision that I've made, and use it to actually reflect on my professional performance is unprofessional. Because I know that as someone who has daddy issues, this is something I've also done a lot of work on. And so to be judged by something that's happened in your past that was completely out of your control in your present is really damaging to someone's self-esteem and their ego. And if you want people to perform, it's important for them to feel like they're valued and that they're respected in the organization. And if you're saying things like this about anyone in front of someone who has issues, and let's be honest, we all have issues. You can like put another word in there and everyone has issues. So instead, consider your own issues and how you've been dealing with them, and whether or not you would want someone to talk about you that way behind your back, and just lean back on it and realize that, everyone has issues. It doesn't, but our issues are not the reason for our behavior every time. And even if it is the reason for our behavior, it's not your place to make that call.
No, absolutely. And thank you for your transparency and for your willingness to open up and speak about this, because not a lot of people have that comfort level to say, "Hey, I have experienced this at some level." Uh, because I feel very blessed where a lot of the people that I've known throughout my life, it's primarily been anxiety or depression, which is
Mhm.
its own entire thing. But you can't really say that one is more impactful than the other. To that person, it's everything. Whether they are dealing with a trauma in their life, whether they have been given a mental health diagnosis, whether they have seasonal depression, clinical depression, anxiety, and a combination thereof, it's all impactful to the individual, which is why we're going through these, is to call attention so that we can be more mindful and better leaders.
Yeah, and honestly, like, I'll tell you, the reason I do this is because of my dad. My dad was bipolar. He was probably transgendered, and he lived in a time that he was not able to self-express and be who he is. And so I believe that that was a direct contributor to his suicide. And suicide is very common amongst bipolar people, with a very high increase of suicide rates with people who've been diagnosed with bipolar and are untreated. So that's one of the reasons that I do this, is because I do feel like if he lived in a time like now, he probably would be alive today.
Wow. Wow.
Mhm.
Just wow on that one, Nicole. A lot of elements there, especially of how we're coming to know ourselves as people, and creating that environment that is more helpful. And I'll go ahead and jump to the next one, because we've surmised this a couple of times, but it's essentially they are just any judgment that you're throwing on that person, whether it's intentional or unintentional, because we ourselves are not always our best selves. We have great days where you're on it and you're being very thoughtful and you're being very kind to everyone, but then you yourself have the bad days too. And it's not an excuse that we can lay on and say, "Oh, I was really busy. I was working on this project. I've got so many deadlines," and you just kind of throw it out there. But really being mindful of any kind of assumption that we're making about another person.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the best practice is to learn how to stop judging yourself. If you can learn how to stop judging yourself, you can learn how to stop judging other people. And that's probably where the real work is, because the self judgment is usually even harsher than the external judgment.
Man, you you hit me on that one personally, because I that was something that I had dealt with, and I've referred to it as like the internal monologue that you
Mhm.
have with yourself for a long time, and I wasn't even aware of this until a couple of years ago. But you can have a very unhealthy internal monologue, and it's
Mhm.
how you talk about yourself, how you think about yourself. If you feel like you're enough, or you feel like you're trying to reach this goal, but then you sabotage yourself by either moving that bar. For me, it's quality. I love doing quality work and feeling that I am accomplishing something, but I would get to a point and say, "Oh, well, that's not good enough," and then I would move the bar. So
Yeah.
then it
Not
created that
celebrating the success.
not celebrating the success of where you were, because it's the sense of, man, and I wish I had put this graph in here because I loved it. You've got someone on a plateau and they're looking up and they're saying, wow, I can never do that. But then in the next panel you have someone looking down, it's look at where I came from, and they're in the middle of that mountain. So I
Yeah,
love the
that's
comments
great.
on not judging yourself and giving yourself that grace, because once you have that for you, you can extend that to others.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, like all of this is personal development work. We're
Yep.
talking about it in the external context, but this is all work that's done on the inside. It's not external.
Mhm. Which is why it's one of the harder areas, because there's not a lot of metrics. It's just a lot of areas of identifying where you personally need that growth, and then like you're saying externally, like, well, we would create a plan and a spreadsheet. No, it's just being aware and moving forward.
Yeah, these are the soft skills. These are the things that, they put into a bucket of like, this is where you just learn to be a good leader. I believe that like most of good leadership is actually found in our soft skills development. And these are definitely soft, this is the way you measure this is whether or not people want to come work for you again after they leave.
Mhm.
That's the way I measure this. Because if people want to come back and work for me, then that means that I have supported their mental health or they wouldn't come back.
Mhm. And that goes into creating that environment that you're talking about, whether if they want to, um, and that environment can be like departmental, that could be with your team, that could be, like I said, within the department, or and ideally in the company as a whole, and how you really create all of this together.
Yeah, so I'll go through this quickly because I know you want to get to some Q&A,
Oh,
but
yep.
basically, to create a safe work environment, one, you have to normalize talking about mental health at work. One way you can do that is talking about it yourself and talking about your own mental health. Two, understand your employees' benefits for mental health, because you are likely to run into people who need help and support. And it's okay for you to offer support even if someone is not telling you they have a problem. It's okay to say, hey, do you need help and support? Did you know that we have this program? And it's even more powerful if you've used it yourself. Like I've used our employee benefits. So when I recommend them to someone else, it comes with a different weight than someone who's never used them and never accepted that they probably need them themselves. And then the last is to lead by example and prioritize your time for your own mental health and talk about it openly. I talk about that. Monday mornings when I don't have my kids, I start my day in a jacuzzi and a sauna. I love to start the week out in a place of replenishment. And you know what? There's a lot to be said for starting your week out a little bit different. So just find those times that you can take care of your own mental health, because like I said, this is more of an internal game than it is an external game. The external game is a reflection of how you're treating yourself.
No, that makes sense. I've heard that before. I think I've phrased that as, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
It's you have to put back into yourself, and all of what you're working on and taking care of yourself, and that's mentally, but then that also is physically and emotionally, spiritually, all of it really working together so that we're creating a whole person that
Yeah.
can be thriving. uh, but yeah, to that, we've we've arrived at our Q&A, so please feel free to pop those into the Q&A section or into the chat, and we'll go over those. For anyone that came in a little late, know that this has been recorded and you'll get a copy of it in your inbox tomorrow. All right.
Perfect.
See, and now we wait.
And now we wait. Yeah, I really do enjoy talking about this topic with leaders, because I do think that it is something that we all want to be more aware of, but sometimes the how, and like,
Mm.
how do you actually consider people when they're in this situation, and how do you even know that someone might be struggling? Some of the common symptoms that I look for someone that's struggling with mental health is I look for, one, job performance is a big one. If I start to see someone slipping, in their job performance, I'm immediately starting to ask questions about what's happening at home. Another one is, just noticing attitude. You can tell when someone shows up to a meeting if they're, in a good place, or if they're off, So if I see someone off, I immediately speak to it with them. I'll ask them to stay after the meeting. A lot of this is about not letting things fester and not leaving things unspoken. So if you're noticing something with someone, speaking to it early and opening the dialogue and just saying, hey, if you have something going on, like, I'm here to help you and support you. What do you need? Like, that's the question. What do you need right now? How can I help you? You talked about, how you approach people in the beginning of the day and saying, how is your day? I like to ask, how are you feeling? Because it actually sets the stage of asking for someone's emotional state versus how are you doing, which kind of gets that normal fine response a lot. I like to just ask a little bit of a different question so that I can get some of that stuff out too.
Yeah. And when someone asks you how you're feeling, and I'll definitely throw this, it's a Southernism. I'm located in Knoxville, Tennessee. And they're like, "Oh, I'm fine. How are you?" No, be real with the people. They're asking you. If they're asking you how you're feeling and you can sense that sincerity, they genuinely want to know. And
Yeah.
even if the answer is, "Well, I'm really excited about this thing," or "I've been really struggling in this area and I'm working on it." Just sharing that and getting it out, whether that's talking to another person or having a dedicated time to do that is so helpful.
Yeah, one of the things I love to do is change my own programming around this stuff. So, part of this is we've just become conditioned to say, I'm fine or whatever. So I like when people ask me the question of how I'm feeling or how I'm doing, I like to say, oh, I'm magical. And
I'm
it
vibrant.
stops people in their tracks. They don't really know how to handle it because no one's ever told them they're magical before.
Oh, goodness. All right, so we do have one question that came in.
Great.
Says, "I'm a middle manager and fully support having a safe work environment and supporting employee mental health. However, my company's upper management is not the same, or sorry, is not on the same page. They think people should just be tough and carry on. Any advice for convincing my managers to be more open and understanding on this topic?" That's a wonderful question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The first thing that I would start with is actually I would start showing them stats on productivity related to mental health. Because if they can understand how it affects their bottom line, then they'll be more willing to spend some money on the top line in order to actually make an impact on it. So I would use data. You obviously know your leadership team and their style. Sometimes you have what we call analytical Archies, which are the people who are like need tons of data and support. They're the ones that are going to need research studies and all that, talking about how it's improved bottom line profitability, how it's improved productivity. But then you're going to have other people who need to hear stories. They need to hear stories of their own people who are struggling. And that might be your story. It might be a story of someone that you've been working with. This is your leadership team. So, there are HR rules around what you can share, and you can share employee situations up the chain because that's your chain of command. So you can say, look, I've been working with Betsy on this, and she's really been struggling in these areas, and as a result of it, her job has been affected. But I did these three things, and I noticed an improvement. So you can kind of start to prototype some success stories in your own group and then take those stories up. So I think it's just about aligning with your own team. I would probably do both. I would do a little bit of a data analysis, and then I would try to focus on our own people and how, one really interesting one to look at is caregivers, people who've had a family member come down with Alzheimer's that they've had to transition into a caregiver role. We actually have a foundation around this. And, those people in particular, they're struggling at home and at work. And if you can create that bridge for them by just telling the story and saying, like, in a way that's like, you can't blame someone for their parent having Alzheimer's. And of course, you want to maintain their employment because they're a really good employee. So those are some things that I would do.
Oh, that's awesome. I love where your immediate thought there was, "Hey, take it to where they need it," because it's not at a higher level. Sometimes it's not where they're so vested in the touchy feely side of this. Especially, and I know, Nicole, you and I have talked about this before. If someone's very more like old school business of what we would characterize of that, which is be tough, soldier on. You can do this, where it really wasn't talked about that
Yeah.
much, just even 10 years ago, and how that's changed. So having those conversations and making it into a metric that is important, but they primarily care about,
Yeah, and
making it
also
there.
like, okay, we want people to soldier on, so maybe we should help them and show them how to soldier on. Like the soldiering on can't be pushing down of everything and repressing it because that's going to create a
Not
culture inside
healthy.
the company that's toxic. So, that culture, even in that moment, I would say, like, yes, we want them to be tough. So we need to provide these tools for them in order for them to be tough, like we want them to be.
No, you you're not gonna send someone out and have them not be well armored or well equipped to deal with their unwellness of
Exactly.
what they're facing. That makes
Exactly.
sense.
And then also, it always comes down to remember this is an internal game. If you're really struggling at your organization and that's an environment that's toxic for you, then I would ask questions on whether or not that's the place that I want to stay, and maybe there's another environment that would be better that aligns with your own values. I know that's difficult. I've worked in corporate America for a really long time. I've worked for some really toxic teams. But I will tell you every time that I've left, I've been grateful.
Those are not easy decisions to make.
Yeah,
Definitely not at all.
not at all.
All right. I don't think there were any other questions coming through.
Excellent.
So it sounds like we've covered a lot of it. If you guys do have questions after the event, feel free. Please reach out to Nicole and I. Like I said, we're going to be sending you a recap that's going to have our information so you can reach out and ask us specific questions. And just thank you all for joining. And thank you, Nicole, for your vulnerability, for sharing your experiences and being real about everything that you've been seeing.
Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.
Bye.